Hi, thank you for watching Digging to China. I'm Dong Xiong. Relations between China and the West are off to a rocky start in 2021. China and the US trade accusations in Alaska, and Europe and China trade sanctions days later. It is obvious that Beijing's tolerance for economic risk in the service of nationalism has rarely looked higher. That could bode ill for many, not least Taiwan and the states of the South China Sea. The trade conflict between the US and China has transformed into a broader geopolitical confrontation in the US backyard. In the meantime, China's armed forces are nearing parity with the US. Chinese incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone have at times become a near-daily occurrence since late 2020. While the US is busy rallying allies such as Japan to plan for contingencies. A significant conflict between the US and China in East Asia is still unlikely, but it can no longer be ruled out as an implausible tail risk. Companies need to start considering what that could mean, and the governments need to find mutually acceptable ways to take the temperature down if they want regular business to remain possible. The most likely scenario is still that the catastrophic potential downsides of any armed conflict keeps minds focused. Even gray zone tactics like a blockade of Taiwan would be hugely risky for Beijing. Taipei might respond, for example, by cutting off China from all semiconductor sales. US and allied trade and financial sanctions would multiply that impact. Taiwan alone supplies around a third of China's semiconductors, including some exclusively produced by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, the world's largest contract chip maker. It is clear that economic deterrence alone is not enough to prevent Beijing from attempting its long-treasured goal of absorbing Taiwan if it perceives distraction or weakness. Accidental conflict could quickly escalate to all-out war. China painstakingly negotiated a bilateral investment treaty with Europe, yet last week it decided to target members of the European Parliament directly. This is the latest sign of Beijing's rising willingness to accept big economic risks. Hong Kong's national security law is the most obvious example. But the US failure to move Beijing on fundamental issues over the course of the trade war can be seen partly in the same light. Why Beijing became so reckless? One possible reason is that the country's state media had just spent days playing up China's muscular stance against the US in Alaska. One popular People's Daily social media post led with two photos. One of China's officials facing down the US delegation across the table during talks in Alaska, and one of Europe, Japan, and the US facing down China after the disaster of the Boxer Rebellion in 1901, an episode that Beijing views as part of its century of humiliation at the hands of Western imperialists. The message was quite clear. China is back, unafraid and powerful. Faced with unfavorable optics of unified Western sanctions a few days later, an aggressive response was perhaps inevitable. However, nationalism has long been a double-edged sword for the Chinese leadership, useful to bolster the ruling party's standing but dangerous when emotions run too high. Anti-Japanese protests over a territorial dispute in 2012 turned into a riot, with residents in Shenzhen flipping and smashing Japanese cars. An editorial in the state-run China Daily at the time said, "This type of patriotism will never receive applause." In the years since, Chinese officials have promoted nationalism rooted in positive energy, a general outlook of optimism and confidence in the country. Meanwhile, they have further narrowed the space for public discussion with more censorship and the regulations of the internet, including detaining users. Jessica Chang West is an associate professor of government at Cornell University and author of the book powerful patriots, nationalists protest in China's foreign relations. She said, I quote, "The Chinese government has increasingly leaned on nationalist rhetoric to justify its rule, while also keeping grassroots nationalism on a much tighter leash. To some extent, the government has been able to use tough talk and bluster to appease domestic audiences, but the swagger has real downsides for China's foreign policy objectives." Unquote. Still, Chinese leaders may also not wish to see things out of control. Chinese state media have kept a close lid on topics such as the border clash with India, an incident that could easily have caused a wave of national anger. Chinese officials, while loudly condemning the US for ordering the Chinese consulate in Houston to close, have limited threats to promising an equal response to US actions. In authoritarian societies, there is a tendency to incorrectly over-attribute agency to the government in controlling the nationalist narrative. Chinese nationalism is not simply elitist party propaganda because China's citizens now play a central role in the conception and the development of nationalism. All of this is a worrying signal for the future, especially if Chinese growth keeps slowing, which is most likely, and the leadership keeps leaning over more heavily on nationalist pride to keep the country behind it. Companies need to start thinking about what that really means. In the event of a trade or financial embargo imposed on China during a crisis in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait, would their assets and the staff in China be safe from becoming bargaining chips? Beijing has actually been relatively restrained in its use of corporate blackmail compared with the levers available to it, recognizing the immense potential collateral damage. But in a real national crisis, it is difficult to know how the government would react. Companies in the region need to start preparing for contingencies, as COVID-19 and the recent chip shortage have both shown. Supply chain diversification and redundancy is expensive, but possibly less expensive than not having it in the end. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment and subscribe to my channel. Just click the subscribe button right here. I'll see you again shortly.